Welcome everyone in our virtual audience around the world. We're so glad you could join us for this event on End Poverty Day 2020, Surmounting Setbacks. I'm Larry Meadow, North America correspondent at the BBC, and it's such an honor to host this event. You all agree 2020 has been such an exceptional year in so many ways. And it will be the first in over 2 decades that we're not able to celebrate progress on End Poverty Day. For the first time since 1998, the global extreme poverty rate, that is the percentage of the world's people living on less than $1.90 a day, that number will rise. The World Bank estimates that 88 million to 115 million additional people will be pushed into extreme poverty in 2020. To be sure, the rate of progress on poverty reduction was slowing even before the pandemic hit for a variety of reasons, chief among them armed conflict and the effects of climate change. The added impact of COVID-19 means that the goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 is now out of reach without swift, significant, and sustained action. So this is a moment to learn about the increased poverty risks, to focus on supporting a resilient recovery. And we have such a stellar lineup of guests from all over the world who can help us understand the challenges and the solutions. But before I introduce our guests, let me remind you of the ways you can take part in this special event. We are streaming in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic on World Bank Live, where experts are taking your questions right now. Also, stay tuned for a special End Poverty Day quiz. I'll be bringing that to you shortly. But first, here's a look at what's coming up over the next hour. A very impressive lineup and a truly global one at that. We'll be linking up to guests in Kabul, London, Islamabad, Dhaka, Vancouver, and Yaoundé in Cameroon. But first, let's take a look at the challenges that confront us as we unite to end poverty.
We all hope for a better future, that our children will be safer, healthier, more prosperous than the generation before. We expect progress. But we face an unprecedented challenge. The gravest reversal in global poverty reduction in a generation. The latest numbers are stark. Extreme poverty is rising for the first time in more than 2 decades. The goal of ending extreme poverty has been set back by at least 3 years.
Just let that thought sink in for a moment. The gravest reversal in global poverty reduction in an entire generation. So, how does the international community respond to this enormous challenge? To answer that important question, I'm joined now by Axel van Trotzenberg. He's the World Bank's Managing Director for Operations. Axel has had a long and varied career at the World Bank, and the common theme has been helping low-income and middle-income countries to develop and fight poverty. Axel, thank you for joining us. Please explain the gravity and the importance of this crisis we're facing right now.
Well, we at the World Bank are extremely concerned. After decades of steady progress in reducing extreme poverty, and for example, in the last decade, lifting more than 500 million people out of extreme poverty, we are seeing a reversal of this trend. And this trend has come with COVID-19, where we are now estimating that between 88 and 115 million people will fall back into extreme poverty. And just to give you the dimension of the problem is that is the equivalent of the population of Egypt or Vietnam or the Philippines. So clearly we are very, very concerned, because what this means is that kids will not go to school. We will have higher mortality rates. We have less clean water. We have higher malnutrition rates. So we are seeing this in concrete indicators in health and education. And that is dramatic. That's our concern. And we should care about this.
So this dramatic reversal that you talk about, is that all due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
No, absolutely not. But it is certainly reinforcing the problem. This is of such global magnitude, COVID-19, that we are seeing this trend. But clearly there are other factors at play as well. Two are very, very prominent, is conflict as well as climate change. State conflict, unfortunately, about 40% of the extreme poor are today living in conflict-affected countries. And this trend is going to increase. Also, climate change is having a massive impact also on extreme poverty, particularly in the poorest countries. Unless we do something about this, we also estimate that climate change will contribute further to extreme poverty, and between 68 and maybe 130 million people could fall into extreme poverty as a result of the effects of climate change. This is precisely the reason why the World Bank, through its Fund for the Poorest, called the International Development Association, is putting so much emphasis on questions like climate change, like fragility. We have been doubling our effort over the last 3 years in investing in fragile countries. This is now reaching about $23 billion. In the next 3 years, we will see a further increase. Also on climate change, we are aggressively working with countries around the world to see how we can mitigate climate change as well as to adapt to climate change. So this is a huge agenda, and we have to take action.
You already talked about this a little, but could you just go into a bit more detail about what can be done, because you created quite a grim picture, and what the World Bank is already doing?
Well, there are clearly two sets of actions. These are the shorter term actions as well as the longer term action. When COVID-19 exploded on the world earlier this year, we made an announcement that we would like to invest in countries in the order of $160 billion between April of this year and June next year. We are well on track. We have committed well over $43 billion to date. But here is first, the thing is about health, saving lives. In this context, we had a program launched earlier this year, helping countries. Right now, about 111 countries are benefiting from from a package from the World Bank Group in the order of $14 billion. And now we have announced the next stage is namely to help countries finance vaccines. And this is a $12 billion initiative that has been presented to our board. And we would like to help here clearly countries to combat COVID with this package. But that is not enough. We have to do more on social protection. We have to do more on the jobs agenda, and ultimately keeping the long-term agenda. This is what we are trying to do with a fairly ambitious package, particularly for the poorest countries that are benefiting from our resources for the poorest. And what we are expecting in these 15 months, that the poorest countries will be able to receive in the order of $50 to $60 billion of support. What concerns is for the longer term is that we need to reverse this negative trend of increased poverty, and also to get back on track with regard to the sustainable development goals. And that will require action by the international community, be it on the multilateral side, bilateral side, but also on the national side. And what we are making the case for is we can, in times of crisis, not leave countries that are among the poorest out of our concerns. There is a question of international solidarity, but it is also smart investment to help these countries back on track. That is what we are advocating, that's what we're doing every single day, and what we need to continue to do so.
All right, Axel, thank you so much for describing the situation and what needs to be done.
Thank you.
I am Shegufta Shariar in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and you are watching World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
Axel will also be taking part in a special live show after this event where he'll be answering your questions. Please share those questions in our live chat or by using the hashtag #EndPoverty. Okay, time now for the first of our quiz questions. Don't worry, we have made it relatively easy for you. You'll have a choice of answers. Question number 1. When did the quest to end poverty suffer its worst setback? Was it A, 2020, B, 1998, or C, 2008? The next question in a moment, and all the answers will be revealed live in the show right after this event. For now, let's hear from women small business owners in Colombia who are benefiting from loans from Banco de Vivienda to keep their companies afloat during the crisis and to protect the jobs they provide. This project is funded by IFC and guaranteed by MIGA. Those are members of the World Bank Group focused on the private sector. Please use the hashtag IFC Impact or Investors for Impact if you're interested in this work.
Somos los dueños de una de las ferreterías más antiguas de Neiva. Llevamos casi 25 años en el mercado, pues adaptándonos a los continuos cambios. Ahora nos toca adaptarnos a la pospandemia también. Más o menos se nos bajaron las ventas en un 70% y estamos ahí tratando de hacer que esto renazca nuevamente. Tenemos muchas expectativas. Además, contamos con un buen equipo de trabajo. Nosotros en este tiempo, durante todo el tiempo de Ferrecastillo, jamás hemos tenido una demanda laboral. Tenemos inclusión mujeres igual a hombres, casi que estamos igual en la planta de personal. Queremos también pagar. Hemos hecho análisis y nosotros decimos, bueno, pero si gastamos 200 y nos toca pagar y estamos haciendo 100, ¿cómo vamos a pagar esto? Igual queremos decirles a ustedes que nuestra intención es pagar, pero pensamos que con el plazo lo podemos hacer. Estamos haciendo una nueva reorganización, estamos haciendo un plan estratégico y estamos viendo que después de esto del COVID, de estar confinados, queremos hacer las cosas bien, queremos hacerlas y tenemos que reinventarnos. Eso sería lo que les quiero dejar y que pasen una feliz tarde.
Antes de la pandemia pues teníamos unas ventas importantes, no teníamos sufrimientos en materia de liquidez. Luego del COVID-19 las empresas se han visto bastante afectadas. Gracias a Da Vivienda hemos podido salir adelante, quienes nos han facilitado los créditos para las nóminas y cumplir con todos los compromisos y poder tener una liquidez importante y salir adelante. Que el grupo HON tiene en su mayoría gerentes que somos mujeres. Entendemos que el rol de la mujer hoy día es muy importante para el país y para regiones como la nuestra.
It is so important that we hear from those voices, right? Because that's how we can really understand the impact the policies and programs we're discussing have on the ground and how they can change lives. Those projects were led by the private sector. And now, to talk more about how we can mobilize companies and business to respond more effectively to coronavirus, I'm joined by Strive Masiyiwa, founder of the Econet Group. Strive, you've recently been appointed as an African Union envoy to mobilize the private sector response to COVID-19. How is that work going?
Well, it's not recent. I've been in this job since about March, and it is full-time. So I stepped away from my business duties. I work full-time with President Ramaphosa and 6 other colleagues. And our job is to coordinate the continental response. So we are in many ways responsible for many of the recommendations you've seen around the lockdowns that have taken place, the mask campaigns, and of course, negotiating with the international community over debt restructuring, debt standstills, trying to create fiscal space. I am responsible for ensuring that the supply chains have been sorted out so that we have supplies of medical supplies. We've done well in that respect, in a difficult situation. Africa's response is probably one of the best in the world in terms of containing the mortality. But it's a work in progress. There's no victory laps with this disease. You work as hard as you can and hoping that we will get to the other side to vaccines without much more loss of life.
Now that you mentioned that, there's been a lot of speculation why Africa seems to have avoided the worst of the coronavirus compared to especially the West. What do you think is the reason for that?
Well, if you like me, you wake up every day and you work very hard, and we have worked very hard. So this has been the most coordinated response of any in the history of Africa to a pandemic. The heads of state, this has never happened before. There's a task force of heads of state that meets every 2 weeks. We as the envoys report to them. We meet every week with the health ministers, with the finance ministers. We're working pretty hard. So we kind of don't like it when people say, well, what do you think could have been the cause other than we work hard? But obviously, historians will have their own space and others to study why it could be. But for us, from day one, look, there are African countries that are just beginning to lift lockdowns. We paid a high price, but we knew that if we don't move to contain it, we didn't have the health facilities and infrastructure to respond. So look, but there are the factors that others can look into.
So what is the role that the private sector should play in managing acute crisis like COVID-19, and then in tackling longer term obstacles to poverty reduction, such as climate change and conflict?
So you've got to look at it, the multiple questions in what you're asking. Yeah. So if we're looking at the pandemic straight up, okay, you've got a crisis on. So the first thing you do is obviously you protect your people, you protect your employees, you ensure that they are able to respond and to protect their own families and their communities. So that's the first message we got through to the private sector. Secondly, depending on the sector that you're in, because some sectors, if you were in tourism, for example, or hospitality, obviously there's very little you can do. But there's always something you can do. You can help in campaigns around getting people to wear masks, supplying people with masks. So there were a lot of simple things that we got the private sector to engage in. I, for instance, have a group of the private sector that meets, it's almost 200 strong from every single country. We meet every week. And that has banks, it has pharmaceutical companies, it has telecoms companies. So we encourage them to work together, to reach out within their sector and to discuss things they can do that are short-term, that are medium-term, and that are long-term.
Africa is key in the struggle to reduce poverty and ultimately to end it. And you're a big champion for entrepreneurship on the continent. You support young people who want to get into entrepreneurship. What is the role of young African entrepreneurs in ending poverty on the continent?
There's no better tool to fight poverty than entrepreneurship. When young people are supported to set up businesses, they can create jobs, they can create wealth, and that's how you fight poverty. It's ground zero in fighting poverty. I have dedicated many years of my life in promoting young entrepreneurs to follow the path that I took as a young man myself when I was only 26, when I started my business, to say you can go out, you can do it, and we've got to give them the tools so that they can innovate, create products and services that can in future become big companies that help us to deal with poverty.
All right, so globally, more than half of the extreme poor are under the age of 15. What do you think, because you talked about innovation, how can emerging technologies and innovation help create quality education and opportunities for all these young people, especially as they come of age?
Well, look, the most important thing we must always do is to provide education, because education is ground zero in anything that you can try to do. We want to create formal education opportunities. There's no avoiding that. We have to create formal education opportunities and to remind people that education doesn't stop. Even if you didn't go to school, you can still learn at 25. You can learn at 35, 45, 50. We want to ensure that there's formal education, but where we can't do it formally, we want to create informal education tools so that people are learning to read, to write, acquiring digital skills that can help them to get jobs or to find jobs. So it's an ongoing piece of work.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Trevor Masiwa, for your time and for your insights.
My pleasure, and stay safe.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Moses Alex Kagu in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and you are watching the World Bank IMF annual meetings.
If you've just joined us, welcome. You're watching a special event from the World Bank Group on End Poverty Day, Surmounting Setbacks. We're discussing the big challenges to reducing extreme poverty around the world. It's the last event in these meetings, but continue to share your feedback using the hashtag #ResilientRecovery. Time now for question 2 of our quiz. Are you ready? Good. What are the 3 major challenges to poverty reduction? A, COVID-19, GDP, and agriculture. B, COVID-19, climate change and conflict. Or C, armed conflict, gender inequality, and migration. There are still 2 more questions to come, and my co-host Paul Blake will be revealing all the answers right after this event. You may have also noticed that we're running a live poll, and you can cast your vote right now at World Bank Live. You will hear lots of guests today talking about the importance of youth, how by tackling extreme poverty, we can provide opportunities for young people. And for many, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on education, employment, and mental health. As part of a special project, Youth on COVID, the World Bank Group has been hearing from young people around the world about their experiences, their fears, and their hopes.
It's been a tough time, as I know a lot of people lost their jobs as well.
Past 5 months have been quite eye-opening for me in terms of reorganizing my life.
In terms of the impact of coronavirus, it's had both a positive and a negative impact.
COVID-19 has definitely had a huge impact on the Peruvian lifestyle.
In my country, COVID-19 has affected how young people get jobs.
122 million people have lost their jobs in India. And it especially hit really hard to the laborers and small traders who accounted for 3/4 of this number.
Personally, COVID had a huge effect on my mental well-being because the only connection we have with each other is through social media. But thank God this exists.
Truth be told, we are the only ones that can rebuild Nigeria, and this time we'll rebuild Nigeria and we are going to build back better.
And we'll be hearing more of these young voices throughout the course of this event. I'm just going to quickly mention another opportunity you have to engage. We're asking people to send us photos of what resilience means to them. Resilient recovery is the theme of these meetings. We're adding these pictures to a virtual mosaic. You can learn more on our website. So we've looked at the impact this pandemic is having on extreme poverty, but two other important factors driving an upward trend are conflict and climate change.
To get back on track, we must tackle three urgent global challenges. The shockwaves from the coronavirus pandemic threaten to push up to 115 million additional people into extreme poverty. In just 10 years, the effects of climate change could increase global poverty by up to 132 million. By 2030, up to 2/3 of the extreme poor could be living in fragile or conflict-affected areas.
These are two massive challenges that disproportionately impact the world's poor. Let's start by focusing on the issue of conflict. Here's one statistic to get you thinking. The World Bank Group estimates that by 2030, countries that are affected by conflict and fragility will be home to 2/3 of the world's poorest people. I'm joined now by two civil society activists who have a long experience in this field. Lemis Aliriani, who has a monitoring and evaluation unit of the Yemen Social Fund for Development, and Orzala Nemet, an Afghan scholar who leads the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. Thank you for both for being here. Lemis, let me start with you. We have seen that extreme poverty, the rate in Middle East and North Africa is doubling every 2 years, largely as a result of the wars in Yemen and Syria, and the number of the poor is growing. What can be done, do you think, to stem this tide?
First of all, thank you for having me on. First and foremost, the war in Yemen has to stop in order to stem the tide of the growing poverty. But until then, the main action is to increase the support to social protection and economic recovery programs. 5 years of war has left 80% of the population at risk of hunger and diseases. A recent report from the UNDP projects that if the fight continues in Yemen through 2022, Yemen will become the poorest country in the world. Not only that, the war has cost Yemen 21 years of development gains. It has affected its social fabrics. It increases violence against women and children, and it displaced millions of people. So it's not only the extreme poverty that is being doubling, but also the human and social capital, because Yemenis needs food, access to basic services such as schooling, water and sanitation, healthcare, income in order to safeguard their fragile economy. So the public servant in Yemen has to be paid, their salaries has to be paid, some of whom they haven't been paid for 2 years. Also, the flow of remittances has to be secured, as many Yemenis rely on their relatives abroad. Social protection programs has to be increased, either direct cash transfer or cash for works, and as well as increased investment in economic opportunities and in promising sectors, and increase access to financial services. Yemen's also needs to link and coordinate the humanitarian action with development, so that to mitigate the impact of aid dependency and handout economy.
Orzala, tell us about how the pandemic is affecting Afghanistan and how that intersects with the efforts to end conflict there and fight poverty?
Thank you. In Afghanistan, I have to start with saying that the issue of poverty is one of the major challenges. It is to do with people affected by conflict that leads to migration and displacement. It's to do with people's access to basic services and people's access to jobs, and also it's to do with people's general livelihoods. There are significant increases in poverty every year, despite massive international assistance in Afghanistan throughout the years of recent phases of conflict, the last 2 decades. I think Afghanistan is on the top of the recipients of donor-funded assistance internationally. However, the issue of poverty has not been resolved. It has not been addressed in a systematic way, despite all these assistance and efforts. In my opinion, one way of looking at poverty is to really reconsider our means of distribution of resources. There are some good examples and models that have been successful in terms of ensuring that people across the country, across regions and localities receive those aids, but the issues require systematic and more long-term commitment to work at.
So Lamis, your organization has played an important role in providing cash for work programs. You build classrooms and you provide microcredits to entrepreneurs. Talk about the role that organizations like the Social Fund for Development can do in fighting poverty, especially among women.
Since the start of the war, SFD has focusing on delivering cash-based services, either through the cash for work or the cash for nutrition, as well as supporting and sustaining the SMEs. During the last 5 years, with support from donors, including the World Bank, SFD has reached more than 470,000 households with cash-based assistance. This is about 10% of the households in Yemen. Women are the primary beneficiaries in 100% of the household benefiting from the cash for nutrition. And in 42% of the households benefiting from the cash for works. So Social Fund is designing the cash for work programs, is designing components of works that it suits women physical capacities and mobility needs in order to increase their participation. And the evaluation had showed us that there is an increase of women participation. And this tells us that economic necessities override cultural norms that constrain women from working outside. In the cash for nutrition, we have also seen that the community educators are inspiring women to send their girls to schools, as they are playing as a role. They are working. They look at them as a role models. Similarly, with the supporting to the SMEs, Social Fund affiliate microfinance institutions are designing products just to target women to increase their participation in economic opportunities. So what we have seen that women's status are improving in their households once they become breadwinners and they bring income to the households.
Right. Orzala, you spent 14 years as a refugee in Pakistan, fleeing the fighting in Afghanistan. In 2019, there were almost 80 million people forcibly displaced worldwide, many of them from Afghanistan. What are some solutions that can help address the needs of refugees and host communities?
In terms of general observations related to COVID-19's impact on poverty in Afghanistan, it has affected mostly the small and medium enterprise businesses like carpenters, masons, daily laborers, and so forth. So the number of poor of the poorest have increased, while those who were at the bottom of the poverty line have remained the same way as they are. There are also, I think, global studies based on UNICEF data that talks about, in terms of children being affected by this. The UNICEF study in 70 countries globally is talking about 45% of children in these countries severely deprived of basic services. I think that requires a serious attention by international community, particularly member states, to reconsider those goals that are set, globally known social development, sustainable development goals, to be revisited and to really look into the new context of global pandemic and the ways it has affected particularly children, poor of the poorest, and small and medium enterprise businesses. These are really serious considerations that we expect to see made by international community, particularly the member states. Now, coming to the question, your second question regarding the solutions for refugees. As you rightly mentioned, Afghanistan makes still one of the largest. After the Syrian conflict, we are the second, but before the Syrian conflict, Afghanistan was a country with the largest number of refugees around the world. That still remains to be the case. We are second, and that means that majority of the refugees are coming from Afghanistan. Our research is highlighting the fact that there is an important need to consider the categorization of people who we call migrants or refugees, because the terminology really matters a big deal. For example, from countries at war and conflict like Afghanistan, we are dealing with several aspects of migration issues, starting from dealing with refugees or those who are leaving due to war and violent conflict, to those who are internally displaced due to war, due to natural disasters, due to economic challenges in their localities. There are also issues of returnees. Believe it or not, but Afghanistan is having the largest number of returnees despite the ongoing conflict in the country after the Second World War, according to research and studies.
Thank you to my guests, Orzala and Lemis. Let's hear now more from our youth on COVID.
In our national context, it's very difficult to adapt the system to remote working atmosphere.
While I was fortunate enough to have a job and earn while at home, I knew the situation had not been same for my fellow citizens.
Some young people are beginning to feel that they are not employable.
Who would have thought we would be living in an era where we had to isolate ourselves from our friends and family to keep each other safe?
I think it's revealed a lot of deficiencies in our public health and education system.
I really want to see initiatives and projects related to helping indigenous people. They are extremely affected by the virus, and because of the remoteness of their communities, it's harder to provide them with the necessary tools to fight corona.
But I believe in the Filipinos.
For every young person in Nigeria, my advice is we've been through a lot, we're thriving, we're growing, we're becoming stronger.
I'm super proud of our frontliners. Kayo po ang bagong bayani ng ating bayan. Pag may chance tayo na matulungan ng kapwa natin, gawin natin. Laban!
Let's stay with the young voices for our next video. We've heard that the impact of COVID-19 is reversing a trend that has lifted hundreds of millions out of extreme poverty since 1990. Young women in Sierra Leone are taking part in a project funded by IFC and implemented by the faith-based group World Hope to learn how to make and sell soap. Soap making not only helps protect communities from the coronavirus, but also provides an income for those most at risk of economic hardship and abuse during the crisis, women and girls.
I'm named Baluto Kalapang, my village today. I'm in age now 17 years. I say school I do. The village fine, they clean, we get pump, one pump, although it need different, but we get pump, we get one primary school. We not get market, we road they not make, we need help. With the farm now, we not get lights. It's the make a happy. I guess person for supporting me with my education. I'm glad about this program very much because this program they make now, we're able to get money. The parents they're not able to get the money fast, they go to us. But now if we make this rope here, we're able to get money for pay with school fees, and we're glad for that way. So they use water, shoulder, we use medicine, country medicine. We don't use that, we use coral for make the soap fine. And if you say this program will make me be a somebody in life. Me, where I grow up, I want to work in a bank or help my family then flow money in my country and help me with people then. Me, I want to move from this village, go to a big city, for go continue my education. We dey pass fine, and when we dey ready for make the soap, we dey go sit down, we agree the date wey we dey make the soap here, and when we get that money there, we get time, we say we dey go keep am, we dey go, if na osusu we dey make am, and we dey able to sit down find now, na one family now, because we dey able to sit down and talk about good thing in our life. The first one go school, we dey talk say we wan go school, but if you say na market man, we dey win market back. We dey able to do good now and make it so. We dey able to sell am at the community and we graduate better. From where I grew up, na they born me, na I don grow up, I don go school, stay at this age here. Then we dey help, we dey cry for help with community, and we back we dey cry for una, to let them help una. For the same program, it's not all the same program now, but other program for member with.
De La Paz in the Dominican Republic, and you're watching World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
If you've just tuned in, you're watching the End Poverty Day event of the World Bank Group annual meetings. I'm Larry Mito, and it is time for our third quiz in our End Poverty Day quiz. And the question is, how many people live below the $5.50 a day poverty line? Is it A, almost 2.7 billion people? B, about 570 million people, or C, almost 3.3 billion people? How are you doing with those questions, by the way? Listen, remember to join Paul Blake right after this event because he'll have all the answers and he'll be putting your questions live to Axel, as well as IFC Vice President Alfonso Garcia Mora. Okay, so keep those coming in using our live chat. And remember to use the hashtag #EndPoverty to share comments, as well as IFC Impact for thoughts around the role of the private sector in particular. We've heard how confronting conflict is so important in the fight to end poverty, right? Now, let's turn to the challenge of climate change. Another big statistic for you from the World Bank Group. Without urgent action, climate impacts could push an additional 132 million people into poverty by 2030. Yes, that's 132 million additional people. To discuss some ways we can take that urgent action and make an impact, I'm delighted to be joined from London by Sarah Collenbrander from the Overseas Development Institute. She's an environmental economist who helps policymakers develop climate-compatible development strategies. I'm also glad to have Salimul Huq of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. He's in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and has written about the interrelationships between climate mitigation and adaptation. Let me start with you, Sarah. The World Bank's recent poverty report maps out how the risk of catastrophic flooding overlaps with extreme poverty. What can countries do to protect people from these risks and develop in a more climate-compatible way?
Thank you, Larry. The important thing to understand here is that there's not just a correlation between extreme poverty and catastrophic flooding. The two are inextricably linked. In urban areas, all households are competing for land that is well located for accessing jobs and services. Consequently, well-located land is expensive because demand drives up prices. Low-income households therefore have a choice. They can either choose to live further away on cheaper land, which will mean they spend a lot more time and money on transport, or they can live on land that's close to the city, but otherwise undesirable, perhaps on steep slopes or near landfill. When they build houses there using concrete and asphalt, that actually increases the runoff and consequently the extent of flooding. The result is that the poorest are left to live in areas that are most likely to flood, and by settling there, they actually increase the extent of that flooding. The other factor to bear in mind is that the poorest don't have access to the basic services and infrastructure that would reduce the extent or the impact of flooding. Stormwater drains, piped water, decent sanitation, weather-resistant roads. Because these households cannot afford formal housing, they settle informally. And then without a legal address, they're unable to connect to water and power utilities, to open a bank account, register to vote. By virtue of their poverty, these urban residents are systematically excluded from the political and the physical infrastructure that could reduce their flood risk. Women, migrants, and minorities are all especially likely to fall through the cracks. The challenge for countries facing catastrophic flooding is therefore how to tackle the fundamental drivers of vulnerability: inequality, exclusion, marginalization. Countries need to commit to meet the basic needs of everyone in the city, and particularly to give low-income and other marginalized groups a voice in policy and planning. This is key to tackling flood risk, as well as the suite of other climate hazards coming down the line.
All right, so Salim, climate change is a threat for all countries, but it is especially grave for the world's poorest, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. What do you think their critical adaptation priorities should be to respond to this mounting risk?
Thank you very much, Larry. So I work at the International Center for Climate Change and Development here in Dhaka, Bangladesh, at a university called the Independent University of Bangladesh, and also in the South Asia region. And I do a lot of work in the least developed countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa as well. And most of my work is working with the most vulnerable communities in those countries and finding ways in which we can support them to be able to cope with the impacts of climate change, which are now becoming more severe. And in fact, I would say as of this year, 2020, we are now already living in a climate changed world. This is not something that's going to happen. It's something that is happening. And together with the COVID-19 crisis, it's a double emergency for the poor communities. And as Sarah said, in the urban sectors, they are particularly the ones living in the slums, but there are huge numbers of them also living in rural areas who also need to be supported and enabled and supported to be able to adapt to the incoming threats of climate change, from floods to droughts to cyclones and hurricanes. And that's a lot of what I do, is working with communities to enable them to be able to be better prepared to the impacts of climate change.
I'm sure both of you must be frustrated when you hear climate change deniers, and considering how grave this is. Real quick for both of you, Salim first.
Sure. So I tell my friends in the US and other countries where they have a plethora of climate change deniers, send them to Bangladesh and I'll show them climate change, and they'll have to believe it.
I think I have a similar strategy to Salim. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm Australian. And of course, Australia was absolutely devastated by catastrophic wildfires at the start of this year. I think that those in Australia might now choose to downplay the risk of climate change, but no one who saw those bushfires raging can still deny it.
All right, Sarah. So what do you think are the most important steps countries now need to take so that we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis into a more climate smart and resilient recovery?
Unfortunately, Larry, I think the first thing we need to do is recognize that it's going to be some time until we emerge from the COVID crisis, and that millions of people are sinking into poverty now. The World Bank's new report actually highlights that 100 million people will fall into extreme poverty this year as a result of the pandemic. So the question is, firstly, what can we do to protect those people from hunger, from eviction, from missing out on education? Protecting them today as the crisis persists will not only avoid an awful lot of unnecessary suffering, but also make it easier in the near future to deliver a climate smart and resilient recovery. Looking forward, the World Bank's report also underscores that these new poor are going to be more urban, as Salim said, better educated, and less likely to work in agriculture than those before the pandemic struck. While cities have been struck earlier and harder by COVID-19, cities are also going to be the engines of economic and human development going forward. Done right, the density and proximity of cities also offers a chance to deliver a high quality of life with a smaller environmental footprint. The most important thing for countries to do now then is to target their policies accordingly, based on who has suffered and where a recovery can happen fastest and strongest. 2 billion people live in informal settlements today, and cities in Asia and Africa are expected to swell by a further 2 billion people in the next 30 years. Our global challenge is to find ways to boost the living standards and resilience of these urban residents, and to do so in a way that is resource efficient. It's not a small challenge. It's going to require an integrated and a far-sighted approach to all manner of policies: social protection, infrastructure investment, urban planning, industrial strategy, and all of that with a close eye on carbon budgets and biodiversity conservation. But if we don't deliver inclusive and sustainable cities, we're going to fail on both poverty and on climate change. So that's where we need to drive forward our resilient recovery.
Right. Salim, as you already mentioned, Bangladesh has been at the forefront of climate change impacts, everything from cyclones, high temperatures, floods. And in July this year, a quarter of the country was flooded. That's impacted millions of people. How does this affect efforts to reduce poverty? And are there any policies that you think can help communities address these challenges?
Well, it's a huge challenge for a country like Bangladesh, one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But we haven't been sitting idle. The country has developed a climate change strategy and action plan. Everybody from the Prime Minister down to the people on the street, all are familiar with climate change. They're all being better prepared. They're trying to build their resilience as we speak right now. And I'll just give you one metric. We had a huge super cyclone called Amphan a couple of months ago that in past decades had actually killed tens of thousands of people. This one only killed a few dozen people because we were successful in evacuating more than 2.5 million people who got out of the path, took shelter in cyclone shelters, and were able to come out. They still did a lot of damage, but the lives lost has been brought down to practically zero. And that's probably the best cyclone warning system in the whole world. So even though Bangladesh is a poor country and people are poor, if they know what to do, they can reduce the impacts of climate change very significantly. And this is true for other developing countries as well.
Brilliant. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Salim and Sarah, my guests. Let's now turn to the young people who've been sharing their experiences and thoughts about living in this pandemic.
I think the best way for us to quickly recover from this would be to scale up our innovation, especially in our health and education.
They will have to invest in infrastructure to ensure that these people have access to basic amenities.
Job opportunities and online education or trainings, especially for low-income families.
We're also investing, of course, giving young people the right skills.
When it comes to education, I think we should start considering how to teach or instruct more in the local languages.
To really cope up with this situation, I think our government needs to bring in schemes to help this more vulnerable sector who have lost their livelihoods.
Loan opportunities for those who aspire to build a local business or even those businesses who were already affected by the pandemic.
Ensuring that young people have access to loans for as many that are looking to start their businesses.
Additional medical staff and support and supplies.
And economic reforms to revive the industries to provide employment.
A big thank you to all the young people who submitted those videos. We've heard some really inspiring thoughts and ideas there. So we've heard from developing countries, but the developed countries also have an important role to play. The United Kingdom was a founding member of the World Bank and remains an important and influential partner in global efforts to end poverty. Last month, Dominic Raab added development to his title, and he's now the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Affairs. We asked him what role developed countries should play in combating COVID-19, climate change, and conflict, and what actions they can take to help build a resilient recovery. This is what he said.
I'm really grateful to be invited to speak to you all on End Poverty Day 2020, in what is clearly a pivotal year. We welcome the World Bank's recent Poverty and Shared Prosperity report and their continued prioritisation of eradicating extreme poverty. The world's made tremendous progress in our lifetime, with the global population living in extreme poverty falling from 1 in 3 in 1990 to less than 1 in 10 today. Tragically, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken the lives of over 1 million people. It's thrown our economies into recession. It's led to a rise in extreme poverty for the first time in over 2 decades. That's got to be a wake-up call for all of us. The pandemic adds to the challenges already facing the bottom billion. Conflict and climate change are pushing people further into crisis, and poverty is becoming more concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and more fragile states, with new pockets of poverty emerging elsewhere as well. In the UK, we recognise our common collective interest in tackling these challenges. We've already allocated over 50% of our aid budget to fragile and conflict-affected states. We're investing heavily in global health and climate resilience and in the research and technology that underpins effective policy making. We support the efforts to improve health and education, particularly our campaign for girls' education. And we support countries as they integrate into the global economy so they can create jobs for their population, particularly young people. But there are limits to what we can achieve by states acting on their own individually. So the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office support a renewed and rejuvenated multilateralism. We want to strengthen the international institutions that help countries tackle together the common threats that they can't tackle on their own. And together, our aim must be that this time next year we'll have succeeded together in containing COVID-19 and restoring the trajectory of sustained and sustainable poverty reduction.
This is Vera Rosauer in Nairobi, Kenya, and you are watching the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings.
It is finally time for our final question in our quiz. Are you excited? I am. And remember, the answers will be coming in our show at the end of this event. So, question number 4. How many people will climate change drive into poverty by 2030? Is it A, between 68 million and 132 million? Is it B, between 23 million and 57 million? Or C, at least 153 million? Remember, there's still time to cast your vote. In our online poll, the question we're asking is, what is the most important action to take to end poverty? Our final guest today, Dr. Sania Nishtar, has direct experience of fighting poverty on the front lines. She is the Federal Minister for Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety in Pakistan and joins us from Islamabad. Dr. Nishtar, thank you for being here. You have worked for many years in the fields of poverty alleviation and public health. Please explain how these two intersect, particularly in the middle of this current COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, poverty and public health are deeply and inextricably linked. And to begin with, we must appreciate that per capita income has one of the strongest association with health status achievement. The poor are also disproportionately exposed to a variety of risks when it comes to access to clean water or sanitation or the status of their dwellings or the environmental risks. They're disadvantaged on all these fronts. They also have poorer access to healthcare, both in geographic access terms and in financial access terms, and they're more likely to be pushed further into poverty and suffer catastrophic risks. But specifically in terms of COVID-19, we're clear that the poor are more exposed to the risk of the contagion because they live in overcrowded conditions, they have limited access to water for hand washing. They are also more likely to use public transport and be engaged in jobs that will not allow work from home. When it comes to the illness, they suffer from the direst consequences. And they also lack savings to cope with the loss of income. And in terms of the long-term consequences of COVID-19 pandemic, the poor people also suffer disproportionately. And just to give you an example, poor children are disadvantaged in terms of distant learning activities. They have less access to internet and television. And so the higher rate of dropout and longer-term consequences are quite inevitable.
You recently launched the SARS program. What can other countries learn from Pakistan's social safety nets? And have you scaled up the SARS program in this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, so SARS is the government's new multi-sectoral poverty alleviation program. It's got over 140 elements that are linked by theory of change, and they target different disadvantaged groups. We spent about a year developing the institutional infrastructure, which also included several digital backbones, which we were able to leverage as we scaled it up during COVID-19. And we used that digital infrastructure to run a SARS emergency cash, which was the emergency cash operations through which the government reached out to 15 million households with a package of $1.25 billion. And each family received an equivalent of $75. The specific lessons that we learned while executing that program had to do with learning new ways of doing things in this age of protracted emergency. We now have deep know-how in designing and implementing a massive national program in a context of complexity and uncertainty with speed. This experience has helped us fast-track the adoption of cost-effective digital ways of working and new ways of coordinating across multiple stakeholders. And it has led us to believe that it is possible for the government to embrace innovation and deliver with dignity and integrity at scale.
You're a medical doctor, so what prescription would you give to governments to deal with this COVID-19 pandemic and go back to a resilient recovery?
So in 2017, I was one of the 3 shortlisted candidates for the position of Director General of the World Health Organization. And my favorite statement used to be, when I used to campaign, that there are 3 things which can destroy the world, and one of them is a pandemic. And I always used to get very perplexed looks around the table because the ministers of health and leaders within countries were somehow unwilling to believe that such a situation could actually unfold, and now it has. So I think that going forward, we will have to take the health security dimension in the human development and in the human capital paradigm very seriously. We have to be cognizant that the international health regulations are a legally binding treaty, and it has obligations for governments with which they must comply. More generically, health system reform is going to be very much on the cards as we get out of the crisis. But we have to be cognizant that a lot of measures related to health systems reform are outside of the competence of the health system, and countries will have to rethink sustainability and welfare and the role of government within that framework. The role of transparency and accountability and fiscal space for social policies and all these things will have to receive the kind of attention that governments have not been willing to give as we go forward. But in the short term, we have to be cognizant that the pandemic is still not behind us. So learning from my country's experience, there are a number of recommendations. The all of society response, strong leadership, clear communication.
Right.
And we have to utilize all the tools we have presently to quell the pandemic and be part of COVAX along with other 168 member states to ensure that we have access to safe and effective vaccines whenever they become available.
All right. Dr. Sanya Nishtar there, thank you. And that, by the way, brings us almost to the close of our event today on End Poverty Day 2020. A big thank you to all my guests who joined us from all around the globe and shared their thoughts on how to build a resilient recovery from the crisis we're in right now. Our final guest has a very special message. Ngwashe Christabel Afalung is an inspiring young doctor from Cameroon and an activist for women's health and strengthening community and preventive healthcare.
As a medical doctor in Cameroon, I am still shaken by the tragedies I have witnessed, especially practicing in one of the conflict-affected regions. I am now seeing how the COVID-19 pandemic is upending lives. In my first year in medical practice, when the violent conflict just started in my country, I received a 34-year-old pregnant woman in my hospital. Her husband had carried her on his back and traveled miles because the local health centers were closed and there was no means of transportation as a result of the conflict. By the time they got to the hospital, the woman and her baby were dead. That was the first time I actually witnessed a man cry like a baby. Sadly, she's one of the thousands who have lost their lives in conflict. Millions of people in my country continue to struggle to overcome the shadows of conflict. And on top of that, coronavirus is destroying livelihoods. The poorest are affected the most because they are losing jobs and they have no access to quality healthcare. As a result of years of mismanagement and corruption, people have lost trust in the healthcare system. Healthcare professionals, like my colleagues and I, are continuously being attacked. there are lessons we can learn on how countries can better respond to pandemics like COVID-19 and conflict. We need to ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes next time a pandemic strikes. We need to learn from this experience, tackle the foundational issues, and ensure that we build systems that are resilient enough to withstand these challenges. We need to prepare comprehensively and proactively. Let's act urgently and build for the future. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. Ngwashi for ending on such an inspiring note. I want to say a special thank you to you in the audience for listening, participating, and learning. It doesn't end here, of course. Stay tuned to hear your questions answered live and to find out how you did in our End Poverty Day quiz. I want to take you over now to Paul Blake, who is live in the atrium of the World Bank Group's headquarters in Washington, D.C.